here with my friend Ernesto Gonzalez, Cuban immigrant, Cuban historian, teacher, and speaker. And we are in segment 2. We just finished up segment 1 of the history of Cuban communism, survival in a totalitarian communist regime, the American dream, and how to guard American freedom in the face of new democratic socialist menace in 21st century America. So we finished up basically talking about your relatives, your visits back to Cuba those 2 times, and looking over some photos and the what one might call the devastation wrought by the regime, all in the efforts to recreate, level the culture and recreate it from the ashes. And so where this leads is really, and exactly that, of the Cuban identity, and many Americans, especially those in academia today, most likely are unaware of the enduring situation and the plight of Cuban citizens today. And as you said before, it's 90 kilometers from
90 nautical miles from the Florida Keys.
From the Florida Keys. How is it that Cuba can be, as you've often said, the country that's forgotten on the Weather Channel, much like Mao's Cultural Revolution, which initiated a big leap forward, and even the plight of the Cambodians in the late 70s under the Khmer Rouge, which one could estimate is so much a part of the apocrypha of world history. If so many aspects of a society and culture that are considered counter-revolutionary, literature, music, television, and film, to name a few, have been sacrificed on the altar of Marxist economic and social theory, what remains then of Cuba, if we can still call it that?
Well, I can give you some examples
and
of
the identity.
I can give some examples of that. As the United States became what Iran calls the Great Satan, we had our own version of it.
Yeah.
And when I mean we, I mean as a country. Anything American was evil. They were responsible for all of Cuba's plight, and there was to be a contempt against them, but always with the hidden threat that someday they may wish to attack. Because after the 1961 debacle, he sincerely believed that America's pride was too great to be humiliated in the way they were, and the next time they would really get the job done. So he instilled that fear into the population. In 1962, if you recall from history, I was actually living there, and I remember tugging on my mother's dress and just asking, "Mom, is it true we're going to get blown up the water?" And I mean, you can imagine what a 6-year-old has to do to just manage to live, and then you have to deal with all this bureaucratic and harassment and political pressure, and the pressure was very palpable at home, as you can well imagine. My father came in, he was very, very tense, and of course, tension is a very communicable disease, and it was something that I had to endure on a daily basis. And it was a question of just biding out time, really. I must mention this, and one of the points I wanted to make was that just because you have, or anyone has an academic background or becomes an academic professor or a teacher and so on and so forth, and gets a greater level of what we call higher education, does not necessarily mean that you're on the left or an ideologue. It really means that you are well informed, and in the truest sense of knowledge and learning, it is to become better acquainted with different forms of thinking and very different forms of knowledge, and then coming up with an educated evaluation of those different aspects. But unfortunately, in our current higher education system, that has been largely eliminated. And learning has been replaced by indoctrination, which I spoke about in the first segment. And I am one of those individuals who does not ascribe to that theory at all. I believe that the true essence of an education is the multiplicity of views that should be espoused without fear, and then to consciously examine it and come out with a definition of your own. Because anything short of that becomes ideological teaching or learning. And having been in the profession for 25 years, I've had to fight quite a bit of a war against it. I call it, my years in college, for example, I call them intellectual gladiatorial combats. Because that's really what it was. If I could go back quickly to 1990, when that young girl confronted me. I never told you in the first segment what it was, but she confronted me and said, I've heard you speak to my boyfriend, and I've listened to your conversation, and I can tell that you know what you're talking about, and you probably have a lot to offer, but you're wasting your life in a dirty old bus.
Yeah.
Why don't you simply take all of that and turn it into a piece of paper, as she called it, a degree, a career, something different. And at the age of 34, I was so much ingrained with that whole mentality of, well, you just have to work and work and work and work. Learning is fun, but you don't make a career out of it. But she made me think, well, what if my father was wrong all along? What if I'm not simply a beast of burden that is going to just work? And by the way, there is nothing wrong with blue-collar work. We need carpenters, we need masons, we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need all of that. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes us a society, that all of us have a contribution to make in society. But there's usually a very negative connotation to the non-academic disciplines, if you will, which is wrong, because there's no such thing as a dishonorable job. A man who sweeps the streets is just as honorable as someone who gives a college lecture. It's just that it's a different role. What would happen if all of us became construction workers, or all of us became street sweepers, or became engineers, or became a single force? Well, then society would not function, because we need doctors, we need lawyers, we need bricklayers, we need electricians, we need people who are excellent at building homes and designing, people in the high-tech field. So by no means do I ever use this as a derogatory form when I speak of what we used to call blue-collar work. It's just that for me, I felt that I could offer more. And to me, education is something that you offer to allow people to learn about themselves, to learn about the world that surrounds them, and eventually learn how to use their thinking skills. For example, many students who take mathematics in school, or even upper level mathematics, they may ask themselves, even if they're not interested in it, they say, why are we taking this? And I've heard this many different times. What good is it going to be? I'm going to be a plumber. What do I need to know this? Or I'm going to just be a carpenter. I don't need to know trigonometry. I don't need to know anything. But the purpose of mathematics, and I am not a mathematician by any means, But I do understand the concept behind it, and that is that it teaches you, as with most disciplines, and that is the whole purpose of schooling, is that it teaches you the ability to develop your thinking patterns and to be able to evaluate different sources. That's why I'm very much against this totalitarian educational system that we're in at this time, where people are told what to think, how to think, what to say, and when to say it, which is not at all part of our great American tradition, which is one of individual liberty and one of individuality, and back to the American dream. Your opportunity to succeed, and I want to make this quite clear, that America is not, and it may sound like a cliche, but America is not the land of guarantees, it's the land of opportunities, and there's a great difference between the two. One guarantees you something that may or may not happen, which is very typical of socialist and communist countries. But America tells you, well, here's an opportunity. If you're inventive enough, you can open your own business. And there are many people out there without a college degree who have become tremendous entrepreneurs. Does it make it any less that some of them didn't graduate from high school? I'm not trying to advocate people to drop out of school, but what I'm saying is we need to take away the stigma that society has created upon the so-called educated and the non-educated, because we're all born with special gifts and skills, and not everyone is the same. Not everyone is meant to go to college, and it's not because of lack of intelligence. It's just that a calling is different for different people. As I said, a multiplicity of arts and crafts and gifts would make a society strong and creates, in the real sense, a more perfect union. And ideological teaching strips away that from students. The ability for choice, the ability for true critical thinking. Yes, they speak a lot about developing critical thinking, but when critical thinking only follows along one track, it's no longer critical thinking, it's indoctrination, which is something we talked about in segment 1. And in my own teaching career, and my moderator knows me quite well, I've always advocating free thinking, even if I do not agree with their point of view, which used to be part of the great liberal tradition. I may not agree with what you say, but you have a right to say it. Today is quite different. Today is you either believe what I believe in, and I'm not saying everywhere, but as a whole, there is a form of totalitarian thinking that's trying to strip away that individuality and create you into a copy of the collective rather than a creative, vibrant, and a person who's a real contributor to society as a whole.
And so going back to the question of the identity of what it means to be Cuban, and you mentioned in the first segment, once you leave Cuba, you're no longer considered Cuban. You take on something other of a traitorous sort, and excuse me, that identity is basically stripped away, and when you say that most likely, where is the nationalism, if it's even there? Is there pride of the Cuban people who are still living in Cuba, or is there anything there, still a light shining in the window?
Well, throughout the 1960s and 70s, there was still that core of hope that things would eventually change, and the promises that were made during the earlier years of the revolution would eventually come to pass. And the 1970s became somewhat of a stabilizing period for Cuba, because that is when the Soviet Union spent tremendous amounts of resources
Right.
in
Right.
Cuba, and it was mostly an import society. We would feed off of out of Eastern Europe. I can remember receiving, for example, stuffed peppers from Bulgaria, and we would think of them, that's gourmet.
Like just out of a can.
Out of a can,
basically,
yeah. Or just about anything that they could provide. The problem was that there was no real system of distribution. The system of distribution was very disorganized. So my mother, again, was the watch woman of the family. They used to give us 3 booklets. And the 3 booklets, one was a food booklet, the second one was a clothing booklet, and the third one was for appliances or electronic conveniences. These were all theoretical, because first of all, you couldn't get anything electronic.
Yeah.
The stores were bare. As far as clothing, I can remember in 1967, I didn't have a pair of socks. So my mother had to pay 5 Cuban pesos, which is a portion of a month's salary, for someone to find yarn. You talk about heat, wearing wool yarn in the summer. But that's all I could get. My jeans were full of patches, and that's kind of trendy today. Kids today can rip up their jeans or buy them ripped and pay a fortune. For us, we had some, but we had to take care of it. I looked like one of the little rascals with patches all over my knees and everywhere else, because when something finally wore out, we wore things until they were finished, until there was nothing else to use. We just couldn't go to a store and just buy a new set of anything. With food, it was whatever was available. If, let's say, the women, I remember, I used to watch the women, they used to get together and they would form unofficial committees, watchdogs of, in this store today we're going to get hot dogs. Today, if we're fortunate enough, we'll get meat or maybe some tomatoes in this other place. And they kept going from place to place to place to place. And it was more or less if first come, first serve. On the other hand, bread, something as simple as bread,
Mm-hmm.
you had to wait an average of 3 to 5 hours every single day to get bread. And sometimes the lines that you've ever looked at Soviet countries, and you see the long lines of people waiting for hours and hours and hours at times. And there was no guarantee that by the time you got to the counter that there'd be any bread left. And it happened quite often. Sorry, ma'am, we're out. And when you're out, you just don't wait for another truck to come in. You're out.
Yeah.
And you don't know what you're going to get it again. So every day became a struggle for survival, talking about survival once again.
Yeah.
And my mother had to figure out ways of finding what to eat. And as a mother and a diligent parent, she often gave up her own ration so I could eat and I could survive. But that's why I was so skinny. I even became vitamin deficient because of the lack of proper nutrition. I became vitamin B12 deficient. In order to get it, you had to know somebody who would steal it from a hospital, and then someone without experience just give you an injection. And I remember my neighbor upstairs who was a communist, but she was somewhat sympathetic to us. I remember her just bending down and getting that shot of B12, the red liquid. And that's the way it was. Every single day was an adventure. What is it going to be like?
So, yeah, and I remember you've mentioned to me numerous times in just over casual conversations and when we've had meals and how many foodstuffs like quality beans, for example,
yes.
just the classic Cuban black beans that your mother, you told me how your mother would prepare them, and in the better times, and that we have here that are just so readily available
Yes.
that they would be considered a delicacy right now. And even how at one point you have memories of how plentiful and abundant food and other basic necessities were, and the cars that people drove, the clothing that people had, how beautiful Havana was and other cities, and so what really has, I mean, obviously we looked at some photos, and the so what is the entirety of what people can expect living in a communist state?
Well, I must say that up until 1964, late 63, 64, and this is very common also, that whenever a new decade begins, it's really a leftover of the previous decade for the first 2 or 3 years of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we still had a reserve of what was left over by the previous administration, which was an open society in terms of free markets. And I can remember sitting with my parents and having wonderful salads and black beans and beef, and then one day everything was gone. But after 1964, everything started to disappear, and of course, always I used to remember. I remember listening to Castro's endless monologues, sometimes up to 6-hour speeches on television, and talking about greatest sacrifice. Imagine just standing in 100-degree weather for 4, 5, 6 hours, listening to an egomaniac just telling the people how there was hope and there was plenty, and it was always about meeting quotas. And then we started to adopt the 5-year plans, which are very common in communist societies. But the 5-year plans never amounted to anything. You were just as poor and just as destitute at the end of 5 years as you were in the first year. But it gave people an artificial hope that things would change. And progressively, people became more and more disenchanted with the system. Yeah. As a result, as a whole, between 1958 and 1970, over 1 million of us left the island.
And that's of course a consequence of, you imagine the morale, and as you have to imagine it, but as though you have to imagine it, but the morale that people have. I mean, there's a song that you and I have listened to
Mm-hmm.
many times. And what's the name of that song?
En Cuba no falta nada, which means in Cuba there is no need of anything. Nothing is missing.
And which is
the furthest thing from the truth, I would say.
Such a satirical statement. And in the song they list out all these different foods and things that people once were able to enjoy, and fish and all the good fish that are in the waters, and right, isn't that right, that you're not even allowed to fish in the waters off Cuba.
No, there is an underground fishing industry, which I discovered when I went back in 1997, because my father-in-law at the time was a very astute man. I used to call him the Godfather, because unfortunately corruption is tremendously rife in such a system. Mm-hmm. In order for him to survive, he had to pay off the members of the Secret Service or the secret police in order to be able to get guarantees of being able to buy illegal food. Now think about that for a moment. Illegal food. What is illegal food? In time I began to call Cuba the illegal island. Imagine an island where you can't find fruit. An island, a tropical island.
Right.
You can't find fruit. And if you dare to have a tree with fruit in it, that fruit is not going to be on that tree for long, because somebody's going to come along and take it away. I remember spending 20 days in my last visit in 2001, and fishermen have to get up 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, which is not unusual, but they have to go undercover because there are patrols everywhere, and they would go and fish. Again, an island where you can't find fish. And you would come by the house and say, hey, I'm going to buy some. You could get lobster, you could get scallops, you can get almost every kind of seafood, but God forbid that he gets caught. Because if he does, I think I shared with you the story of the cow. Would you like me to share the story about the cow?
Yeah, sure.
All right, in Cuba, meat is one of the greatest delicacies you could get. Now, there's such things as illegal cows. Now, you may wonder, what is he talking about, an illegal cow? Well, everything in Cuba, of course, is managed and completely supervised by the government. So let's say you're a dairy farmer or you're a meat farmer, and you have in the countryside, you have your own herd, which of course is counted. And the caretaker, that's all he is. He's not an owner, he's a caretaker. And he has to account for those cows. Let's say it's a meat cow. And what if the government has an order? Well, he has to fulfill it. And I was told unbelievable stories that the average American wouldn't be able to understand because they're so incredibly fantastic. One in particular was a story of have you ever tried to steal a cow through a barbed wire fence? It takes a lot of work. And it was not uncommon in the countryside for people, I know, and I do apologize because this is a family program, but they would actually get these cows, drag them into the forest, butcher them, take them to, or sometimes just take them to a local house in the bathroom and butcher the cow right in the bathtub, if there was even a bathtub, and then just cut up all the meat and just sell it to whoever was reliable. But then again, in a system where being able to tell on your neighbors is encouraged, which is part of a system called CDRs, called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, and these are watchdogs that watch every single move that you make. So you're always one step away from potentially being imprisoned. That's the kind of life that you live. I mean, the tension, the fear, the anxiety, that's just all part of living. And, well, what do you think is going to happen to that meat farmer when the government comes in for the count? What did you do with this cow? It says here you have 30 head of cow, get 29. What happened to it? That person could be called for sabotage.
Responsible.
Sentence as of 1997 and 2001 was 25 years in prison for sabotage against government property. And the same thing was with everything else. There's no liberty of any kind, and everything is illegal. However, they do have, now the term is not going to make an initial sense when I mention it, but they're dollar stores. Okay, well, we have dollar stores here in the States. Dollar stores are not what you're thinking. Dollar stores are places where the stores are stocked with almost everything you could get here. But you have to buy them with US dollars.
When did these dollar stores first pop up?
Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1991. And Cuba started to import basic goods from other countries, primarily Western Europe, and stock their shelves. And it was a period of, you can only imagine, you've been completely dependent on the Soviet Union for a period of almost 30 years,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, it's all gone.
Yeah.
So in order to keep the country afloat, they had to do something that he loved to do, and that's to legalize the American dollar.
Now why? Now why do that? Why do that if if having if being the idea is the under the revolution, the central idea is to be self-sufficient, be grateful for the minimum, I should say the bare minimum that you have, and to seek anything, of course, to seek anything beyond that is counter-revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Why, and of course, why would you want to have anything to do with a capitalist society? Because again, that is the antithesis of the communist paradise, the ideal of the paradise, that all of that is that's luxury, that's
Mm-hmm.
Western vanity, that's the decadence that they hated,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, loathe to do. But why even sacrifice just a little bit?
Well, there's an old saying about having a need and doing the very opposite of what you believe in order to survive. And he found himself trapped, and he rationalized using the American dollars because, partly because there is an active market in what is called remesas, or money that is sent to Cuba by relatives who have left the island, and they send them money in order to survive. Millions of dollars are sent primarily from Florida to Cuba for their families in order to survive and have the dollars to be able to go to the dollar stores and be able to buy basic goods and necessity that we just take for granted here. We take so many things for granted in this country. Is absolutely embarrassing when you think about the tremendous need across not only Cuba but along the undeveloped world, where things are not even thought of because of your particular station in life. But one thing about communism, it makes everyone equally poor. Unless, of course, you're a member of the elite.
And that's saying something there, as you've said before. It's true that, is it not true that Cuba was once in terms of its GDP, if we want to use that metric, if not the single most among the most the richest countries in Latin America.
Yes, as of the 1960, if you want to have a look at the 1960 UN statistics on Latin American productivity, you'd find Cuba at either 1, 2, or 3 as far as overall prosperity. And GDP, gross disposable product, or GNP, gross national product, it had a tremendous amount of public ownership. There was also a great deal of American investment in the Cuban economy. We had some of the most progressive, and I use the word very carefully because of what it means today. We had one of the best systems of retirement. Workers were allowed to unionize freely. There were unions for just about everything. And again, as I have shown you in the famous video that we watched together, you saw a photograph of what a store looked like before the revolution. It was stocked up to the ceiling in goods. Well, that didn't last long. And The problem is that at the time Castro took, I mean, these were millions and millions of dollars that flowed into the island, but the families only got a portion of it. Let's say you say $300, they may get $100. And since there's no real communication between the islands, that's done on purpose. Now, of course, the cell phone has changed a lot of things since probably 2008, 2009, when phones were first allowed, because they were illegal. Cell phones were illegal on the island. But as soon as the government, they used to have these, if you recall back in the early days in the 1990s of the internet as an overall practice, they used to have these, what they used to call, you might have read them in history books, internet cafes.
Sure. Yeah, they still exist in many places.
In Europe, they're still pretty popular too, as I understand it.
Yes.
At least they used to be.
Yes, there are many in France, Germany. They are all over the place.
Now, that sounds wonderful, but the problem is that the internet opened up the world to the Cuban people that they didn't know about. And they started to see what the other part of the world had and what they didn't have, which is always dangerous.
That is reminiscent of what happened leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I recall seeing a photo of the first McDonald's that opened in Moscow, with the line of people just wrapping around a couple blocks, or even a story of a professor of mine at from my undergraduate years, who back in the 80s spent time with his wife in Moscow, and they had been approached by a band of young people who were simply asking for, not for money, but simply for any music, Beatles music, in fact.
Oh, sure.
Anything.
Well, back in, I remember in 1963, the affluent part of the family who had become members of the Communist Party, and they had special privileges to travel to the Iron Curtain, or what used to be called the Warsaw Pact in the Soviet Union, which is the counterpart of NATO. And I remember my cousin bringing me into his room, and he said, "Listen, I just got this record. It's a group from England called the Beatles. They're the hottest thing around. You want to hear some of their music?" I said, "Sure." I never even seen a record player before, and I remember the cover, and which I wound up seeing it years later when I arrived in the States, and they had that privilege to be able to come and go, but eventually all of that disappeared. And that brings another interesting aspect to the conversation, because we were allowed to listen to British music and even European music, but not American music. For obvious reasons, it was a political problem, because American music, especially during the 1960s, spoke about a lot about not just love songs, but a lot of changes and rebellion and political statements, which of course they didn't want to hear, and they didn't want the public to hear. So there were political reasons for it.
Anything to avoid fomenting any dissent.
And in terms of information, this is long before in the 1960s. I remember listening on the phone, not on the phone, we didn't have a phone, that was too much of a luxury item. On the radio, we had a 1950s radio that we had to just put the blinds down and just put our ear to it. We used to listen to something called The Voice of the Americas, which is similar to Radio Free Europe, which I believe still exists. Later on, there would be another edition that would come out called Radio Martí, based on the famous Cuban patriot and poet who died in 1895 in one of the wars of independence before the U.S. Invaded in 1898. And I remember listening to the 1964 elections, and my mother hadn't yet woken up to the realities of it all. And Barry Goldwater was shown as a warmonger who would bring about an immediate World War III. Remember that we're in the midst of the Cold War now, and all the aerospace developments all came from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, if you recall, had a quick jump start on America. For the first satellite that went up was Sputnik in 1957. It wouldn't be until 1959 when America sent out its own Telstar, and thus in late 1960 the space race began. But that's all we heard. All the great exploits. Yuri Gagarin in 1961 being one of the first men in space. I mean, he was in comic books. Everything Soviet was just wonderful. And there were no commercials because, oh, by the way, commercials were forbidden because the country controlled everything. So commercials, political posters, of course, were not permitted because it's a one-party system. You can't have pictures of Fidel just everywhere in the island. You can't wallpaper it. So people understood this is what we believe. And I remember listening to the elections, and my mother told me very clearly, she says, oh, you don't want that guy Goldwater. He's going to blow up the country. He's going to blow up the whole world. You want the other guy. Which was, by the way, we were never told about the Kennedy assassination in November 22nd, 1963, because it was American news. I found out about the 64 election by listening to it on the radio, and I was only 8 years old at the time. And we had to listen very carefully because we had a communist informer right adjacent with our apartment,
And
because we shared patios.
And with walls that I'm sure were
They
paper thin, literally had ears.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
My father ran a little shoe cobbler job out of his patio, charging nickels, quarters, and dimes. In comparison to, I'm using those terms, and so it becomes more understandable because the currencies are very different. Basically, the Cuban peso is worthless. As I remind you of the value of the dollar, which is at this point, as of March of 2022, is worth approximately 68 cents. And dropping. As things become more expensive, inflation grows.
Yeah.
And so I got very, very little information about America. And it was important that we didn't, because again, they didn't want us to know. Much later, in the 1990s, late 1990s, when cell phones started to show up in the early 2000s, they would monitor the frequency so they could listen on your conversations. Remember the video where all the phones were bugged and the amount of files that were available? I mean, they knew about you, and this is before the computer age. They knew what was going on. They knew who was for them and who was against them. And one false move, and you were done.
And just one, I've heard this before. I know you have. There's a question that often arises. How haven't some of the previous administrations in the United States been responsible also for wiretapping? Hasn't that occurred here, and how is that any different? Are we, maybe we're guilty of the same tactics? Can we, in short, can you touch on that, just as far as are we responsible for the same evil? Is it equivocal?
Well, as society has become more and more technological in this country and around the world, technology, as you know, can be the proverbial double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
It can offer an incredible opportunity for information, research, but it can also open the door for surveillance. And we know very well that the government, the U.S. government, has abused its rights. The whole NSA scandal, the National Security Administration scandal, the Lois Lerner affair, nobody talks about that anymore. What was that all about? It was spying on American citizens. The FBI, the CIA, raids on people's homes over the last few years that would have never been thought of.
And of course, everybody remembers Watergate.
Yes, in 1972, when President Nixon allegedly ordered the break-in into the Watergate Hotel, and that word "gate" has become very much part of our vernacular, and that brought about the end of his presidency. And in terms of culpability, it didn't seem that big of a deal in 1972, but the tapes that were kept, immediately, well, obviously, I remember going to work and listening to hours and hours of the Watergate hearings in 1973, and eventually led to his resignation in June of 1974. So yes, surveillance have been a major problem of the citizen here in this country, and it's getting worse, because it's not just Americans surveying or surveilling other Americans, but also international hacking or interruption into our politics and into our technology world, the IBMs, the Googles, the Microsoft, Apple. We don't know how much communication there is with alien governments and hostile governments to this country. So it's become a very insecure world as a whole. Your phones, Alexa, they could be spying on you, smart TVs, and that's not paranoia. That's been documented.
It's in effect. I mean, the information age has opened up. It is, and you might describe it. It might be safe to say to describe it as having opened up Pandora's box. Considering that it's a government agency is just full of different loopholes, and there's so many people who are able to exploit this, and there's so many, and I hesitate to say it as a compliment. It's not a compliment, but so many people who are just so adept and so skilled, not always for the right reasons, at exploiting these weaknesses. And it's and the other thing I wanted to add is
before we move on, let me just make another point on this. That ironically, the age of information has created some of the least informed individuals in the history of our country. You would think, with the open windows of the internet and the world it represents, libraries have been virtually ignored unless you're in a university and you have to do in-depth research. Hardly anyone goes to libraries anymore. They look up something on Wikipedia or some simple search. Oh, that is the truth. That's definitely it. Real research is becoming more and more rare. But for those of us who have been in the world of education, you would think that we would have the most literate generation or generations of all, because the internet has been around, well, officially since 1969, but as far as to the public, I remember getting Windows 95 in 1995 when I used to be a PC user, and how it started to develop. But you go onto a street and you find a fellow citizen that doesn't even know when the Civil War started. Doesn't even know, to be complete about it, they don't know much about their own history. Americans, unfortunately, are very much misinformed about their own history. Never mind international history, never mind international affairs, ancient history, medieval history, and so on. And you may ask, well, what do we need to know all these things? Because history, without history, there is no future and there is no present. And you're liable to fall into pitfalls that you may have been able to avoid had you known what preceded you.
And we'll definitely revisit that in the next segment. I guess one thing I was wondering about, and I'm sure others, with the shift in culture and people starting to look for things like the Beatles music and so on. What happened to all this beautiful Cuban music?
Oh, yes.
Where did all that go? I mean, of course, you go to Miami and you hear some things that are reminiscent of it, but it's most likely, I'm guessing, not quite the same.
No, because the essence of Cuban culture has been largely destroyed in the island. Let us not forget, for those of us who study history, that Spain spent 404 years in Cuba. That is longer than any of their colonies. And from a linguistic perspective, there is no other world superpower that has left a greater imprint on the linguistic culture and history of any nation. Spanish is the most widely used language as far as, not internationally in terms of business, but as far as the number of countries, that actually 21 of them, if you count Equatorial Guinea,
Exactly.
speak it. So the Spanish left a great deal of legacy. Cuba received a lot of direct legacy from Spain, more so than their colonies, which they began to give up as the empire began to decline in the 18th century, and then in the 19th century. They lost most of their colonies by the 1820s, but held on to Cuba. And it took the Spanish-American War to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. But we absorbed a lot of their culture. Are there unfortunate parts of our history? Of course, definitely. Slavery was still legal in Cuba until 1886. And it wasn't until after 1886, when the slaves were freed, that we had a massive flow of immigration from Europe to fill in the gaps of slave labor and entrepreneurship and so on. My grandfather on my mother's side arrived in Cuba shortly after 1886 and established a business. And speaking about diversity, Cuba used to be one of the most diverse places in all of Latin America. We had people from India, from China, from just about everywhere in the world, because we opened the door for opportunity, much as it was here in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So in Cuba, you could see a Chinese person, you could see someone with red hair and blue eyes, you could see people like me, you could see a former black slave whose family goes back to the days of slavery. We had a tremendously diverse society, and we didn't have a lot of the division that exists in this country right now. We learned to live with one another. Yes, there was racism, definitely, but eventually we realized that we're all, literally, as it's become a saying these days, that we're all in this together, and we were. So I had friends from many different backgrounds, and we never really seriously looked at color or anything like that.
Well, that really, because I'm very interested personally in culture and hearing about the contrast between then and now, as I'm sure our viewers will be.
I should answer your question more carefully then. Up until the late 1950s, Cuba was a so-called hotbed of musical, again using the word diversity. Many Cuban musicians eventually wound up in the United States. We had many different types of what would be called Afro-Cuban music, which had elements of Europe and elements of the former slaves, and we created a tremendous number of jazz artists.
Can you name just a few that people might have heard of, or they can investigate?
Well, you can look up some of the older artists such as Chico O'Farrell, who came here in 1947 and became one of the greatest band leaders in American history. We had Arturo Sandoval, who arrived here much later in 1981. We have,
of course, there's that movie,
For Love of Country.
For Love of Country, the Arturo Sandoval story.
Paquito de Rivera, a great saxophonist,
Mm-hmm.
who came here, and not only in the world of music. Cuba is very well known for its tremendous abundance of baseball players,
Mm-hmm.
because baseball is the national sport still of Cuba, and we
Interesting.
a lot of Cuban players used to enter. 1959 was the last year. As a matter of fact, the Boston Red Sox used to have a man called Louis Tiant, who came in 1959, and got a chance to see his father before he died in the 1975 World Series, which I got a chance to go and see.
Mm.
And there were several other, Tony Oliva, another Cuban, and so we exported a lot of, when Cuba lost a lot of its population due to communism, a lot of those people came here. Musicians, doctors, lawyers, and one of the sad things about many of these professionals was that their licenses were not acceptable in the United States. So doctors, lawyers, architects had to take all their courses again in English and re-earn their degrees. So if we talk about the immigrant experience, the early immigrant experience was to work during the day and whatever you could find, and then go at night and learn English. That was considered standard. And as of 1973, this is 73, I remember listening to my social studies teacher in high school, and he said in the last 50 years we've been considered, not because of ourselves, but history has called us one of the most influential groups ever to enter the United States in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. Because if you look at Florida, you see the tremendous amount of growth.
Definitely true.
Miami used to be a little backwater community for retirees. We turned it into a giant metropolis. Yes, along with success and along with all these different benefits come along. Crime, and in 1980 we had a little bit of a black eye with the Maria boat lift, which we can talk at another session, how that darkened our image. But we are people who are extremely patriotic. We're very thankful for being in this country because we know what the alternative is. And I challenged those of you out there who think that we are such an evil country. Go ahead, go to North Korea, go to Cuba, go to Vietnam, go to Laos, go to Venezuela, and just dare to speak something wrong, considered wrong against the government. See how long you're going to be able to stay on the streets. Value your constitutional rights. And we're going to get this into greater detail in another segment. But if you do not value your constitutional rights, you, in my view, you have earned a right to lose them. And if you do, you're not getting them back. We haven't gotten it back in 65 years. So something to think about for our next segment. So please, go on.
And on that note, what is happening in Cuba today on the political front? Are people tired of what's going on in their country? Are they trying to resist? Is it even possible that there could be a successful uprising? I mean, you as well as I know very well from Facebook and all the social media, and about all the people at great peril,
Oh yes.
taking cell phone footage, releasing that through these channels, showing what the police are doing to people, the beatings, people coming out,
Incarcerations without trial. Yeah.
and is there a possibility that the people could truly finally unite and say this has to end?
Well, this is a question that has been posed to me several times over the years. And in a totalitarian society, it's extremely difficult to organize an uprising. Because one of the things you need to remember if you study the history of Cuba, which we'll get into again in another segment, the very freedoms that Castro claimed were not there were the very freedoms that allowed him to form an uprising. An extremely free judicial system, free markets, unionization, freedom of speech.
And if I may, there's almost a parallel to the days where a young Adolf Hitler was able to take advantage of a loophole in the
sure.
German Constitution, which allowed for many parties to have an influence, to be able to sway public opinion, and then the result of that being him very quickly using his position to take away his opposition.
Well, when we get into the history of Cuba, we'll get into again greater detail.
Yeah.
But he came out as a constitutional restorer, because Cuba has always yearned to reestablish the 1940 Constitution, which is in many respects is very similar to ours.
Yeah.
And to this day, we're still waiting for it to take place. And of course, there's Castro, the propagandist, and Castro in reality. By the time reality set in, it was too late. He had already cemented his power, and he eliminated all of those. This is common in communist nations or socialist nations. And by the way, people talk about the differences between the two, and we can talk about that as well.
I wanted to end this segment.
Yes.
My last question here is, and I've known you to be a godly person who, you possess what I would say is godly wisdom, prudence, discernment. You not only go to church, you pray with your family, you instruct others, guide them in their walk with God, and you strive toward the Great Commission in bringing others to Christ. In a communist society where subscribing to any belief system other than total devotion to the state is tantamount to treason,
Yes.
is Christian belief and evangelism still possible?
Well, it is possible, and it does exist, just as most of the repressive regimes in the world have what they call underground churches.
Such as in China.
And the gospel is being preached but at great peril, again, to
Mhm.
your freedom, because it is, don't, let's not forget that in communism, religion is completely forbidden and is considered a crime, because you can't have two religions. There's only one religion to the state. You have a competing religion, well, there's a problem now, because now you have to allow perhaps God to have a say, and even God is try to put a muzzle on him, but you can't do that because God is sovereign.
Mhm.
So it's, even though he did start very early. I remember one of the last masses I ever went to. In 1966, it was a mass in Latin in a Catholic church, because, as you know, Spain was a Catholic country,
Mhm.
so we inherited the Catholic background as well. But it was a nominal Catholicism. It wasn't really anything really devoted. I had no idea about it, the Protestant church. It was very, very tiny. We did have a vibrant Jewish community which was persecuted as well. When has there been a time when Jews have not been persecuted? Cuba was no example. I
Mhm.
mean, no exception to the rule. And to answer a question you asked me earlier about whatever happened to the Cuban spirit, Cuba,
The identity. Yeah.
by its nature, is a very festive. As you know, it's also common in the Hispanic culture. We tend to be very festive individuals. And Cuba at one time was filled with parties and clubs and dances and concerts, and just the arts were flowing. But as you know, a lot of music, the pre-revolutionary music, is forbidden because it has aspects of freedom. And people say, well, if we had it back then. But you also need to remember
The old ways. Mhm.
that a population that was once, it was anywhere between 6 to 8 million when I left in 1968, has ballooned to over 13 million today. And many of those 13 million people do not have any idea of what Cuba was like before the revolution. They grew up in it, they developed in it, they've been inculcated in it. But I was just talking to someone recently from Cuba, and he said, "I don't care, Al. I'm sick of this, as you were talking about. I'm tired of playing games. We need freedom. We need openness." I mean, they did have an opportunity in 1988 when Gorbachev went to Cuba and talked to Castro about doing the same thing he was doing in the Soviet Union. Castro said, "No, we're not going to go that way." Earlier in 1976, there was a clause in the Cuban Constitution that stated that if you could get the signatures of 20,000 people or more in a referendum, the Cuban Constitution, the Communist Constitution that is, could be adapted or it could be amended. Well, over 20,000 people signed signatures. What did he do? With a stroke of the pen, he changed the Constitution and he eliminated that clause in the Constitution, and then he went after every single person who signed that petition. And that's just the way things are over there. And you ask about a future, you ask about rebellion or change. Well, let's not first forget that Cuba's an island. Where are you going to go? Who's going to aid you? You just can't cross the borders of Europe and try to get help from other countries.
It becomes a floating prison.
Exactly. I've called it often a floating Alcatraz, because that is what it is. In the areas that Castro used to launch his attacks against the Batista regime are highly guarded places and mine places with barbed wire, landmines, and troops, because he doesn't want the same thing that was done to him. I mean, that he did to Batista to be done to him.
Yeah.
So, and there were rebellions in 1994 under Clinton. He just said, "Okay, anyone who wants to leave, let them leave." And you can imagine. I mean, that whole stretch, if you're not familiar with it, for those people out there who are not familiar with it, the stretch from Havana to the Florida Keys is one of the most treacherous stretches of waterways in the world. Sharks have fed upon many Cubans who have tried to come that way. In those days, that was before President Clinton abrogated what remained of the Cuban Adjustment Act. He took the Cubans that were still alive, placed them in Guantanamo, and then brought them over to the United States. And in 1996, he severely restricted it, where the wet foot, dry foot policy, which we could talk about in greater detail, meaning if you made it to the States without being caught, you could remain, but if you were caught, even if it was from here to that wall, if you got caught by the Coast Guard, you had to go back. And imagine the horror of having to go back. What was waiting for you? It was better just to drown in the ocean. It was that bad. And then finally, this past 11th of July, there was another uprising. Thousands of people went on the street protesting, down with communism, down with Castroism, down with the revolution. Over 700 people were imprisoned. And they're still going through trials, of course, which are not real trials. Average sentence, 25 to 30 years in prison. Even minors are being given. This is all verifiable. So there's your answer. Unless there is a direct intervention by the United States, I cannot see an organized rebellion. Where are you going to get the armaments? Where are you going to get
Even
the
the
resources?
Even the numbers in your estimation wouldn't give any strength at all to the.
Well, who's willing to sacrifice their life? Because you may be just talking to an informer. You live in a paranoid society. Who are you going to trust? And it's all done on purpose. It's all by design. There's no accident here. Okay.
So, speaking of design, we're going to talk about where all this started in our next segment.